The offices of Health Nexus and OPHA are upon sacred land that different Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island had lived in relationship with for 15,000 years. This particular land is the territory of the Huron-Wendat and the Petun First Nations, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. As a settler residing on this territory, I want to thank the Mississaugas for their generosity in peace building, and I want to recommit to my own lifelong reflection and action for my unlearning and learning, working and living as an ally, and supporting decolonization. I invite you to join in a moment of silence for us to honor all Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island, their lands, and the splendid life around us which support our well-being and our work, all water, minerals, trees and plants, animals, and human communities. We honor and acknowledge the land in order to seek a more balanced and just relationship with this land and Indigenous peoples. Hello again and welcome. My name is Gillian Cranius and I'm a bilingual health promotion consultant at Health Nexus. I'm one of the two co-coordinators of the CLiP project, and you'll be hearing shortly from Roberta, who's the other coordinator. I want to first identify myself as a person of European descent, a white settler born here in Toronto, and a middle-class bisexual mother of two. As I mentioned, I'm co-hosting today with my colleague from OPHA, Roberta Timothy, and also my colleague from Health Nexus, Andrea Bogdan, is with us as our webinar master, and you'll see her quite active in the chat box, and behind the scenes she'll be doing lots of help as well. So today our purpose is to share the results of the CLiP literature review and provide greater clarity on inclusive, equitable, and collaborative leadership in the nonprofit sector. This literature review comes out of the context of the CLiP project, which I'll speak to you about briefly in the next few slides. Then Roberta will follow with the literature review presentation, the bulk of our hour together. And after she's presented, we'll have about 10 minutes for question and dialogue before our lunch hour is over. Bon appetit to anybody who is multitasking at this time. So about our project, it's called Collaborative Leadership in Practice, and it's a bilingual project that is for 2 years duration, and it's funded by the Ontario Ministry of Citizenship and Immigration. Their goal is to strengthen collaborative leadership in the nonprofit sector. And within this program, they've been funding a variety of exciting projects on inclusive leadership in order to better reflect the costs of changing demographics and increased diversity, to welcome newcomers and to build a culture of inclusive leadership. So within that stream, we were funded, Health Nexus and OPHA together, for this 2-year bilingual project. We're focusing on leadership in the nonprofit sector, but specifically in the context of partnerships and networks. And we've been developing and sharing knowledge, tools, and different learning opportunities, today being one of them. You'll be able to visit our website if you haven't already for further resources, and later on to access the recording of this webinar. What we have accomplished so far is we have had a website. I imagine some of you were on our webinars back in June when we were launching the website and sharing some stories from some of the various partners in the project. We've got a couple of tools up there, and we have several others in the works. The literature is on its way. You're going to hear about it today. And we have webinar recordings. We do anticipate having at least 2 more webinars in the winter before the project ends at the end of March. We had incredible learning and gathering opportunities this fall at the Bilingual Learning Institute in Toronto, which was a 2-day learning institute. We had a 1-day regional gathering in Brantford, southwestern Ontario, and a French regional gathering in Ottawa for eastern Ontario. So now I'm going to introduce Dr. Roberta Timothy. And for over 20 years, Roberta has worked utilizing anti-oppression approaches as a community organizer, therapist, trainer, group facilitator, researcher, professor, and clinical supervisor in both community and educational settings and in her private practice. She's also the co-founder of Continuing Healing Consultants. Andrea has just placed in the chat box, if you'd like to read Roberta's full biography on our website, there's the link in the chat box now. Thanks, Andrea. So, Roberta, I will pass it to you now to share with us about this tremendous work that we've done.
Thanks so much, Jillian, and thank you, Andrea, for being here, and welcome everybody to the webinar today. I would like to start my presentation by locating myself in the research and the project. I identify as an African diasporic woman from a working class background, daughter of immigrants via the Caribbean, mother of two, living and resisting with a visual disability in Turtle Island, Canada. I'm a researcher, a community organizer, educator, and therapist with over 25 years of intersectional anti-oppression praxis experience. I'm very excited at the opportunity to share the results of the literature review with you today. I believe that this is an important step in engaging community members in discussions about the importance of utilizing an anti-oppression, equitable, collaborative leadership framework in your partnerships and networks in the non-for-profit sector. This is the agenda for my presentation. First, I will discuss the methodology and objectives of the literature review. Next, I will present the findings as follows. I will briefly summarize the definitions found in the literature of what is collaborative leadership, and will present a couple of models. Next, I will provide a brief overview of some prominent examples found in the literature concerning collaborative leadership in education, health, interprofessional collaboration, and collaborative leadership in the non-for-profit sector. I will then talk about collaborative leadership and intersectionality and anti-oppression. I will conclude my presentation with some recommendations to strengthen your collaborations and your collaborative leadership skills. So, methodology. The scoping review aimed at evaluating the status of inclusive, equitable, and collaborative leadership frameworks, models, and practices across different disciplines, particularly in relation to non-for-profit sector. Particular attention was paid to existing policies that promote diversity and inclusion in governance, volunteer management, and delivery of services. Additionally, the overall implementation of anti-oppression practices and collaborative organizational processes within the non-for-profit sector were examined. The objectives of the literature review were the following: to identify the extent, range, and nature of inclusive, equitable, and collaborative leadership studies, models, frameworks, practices, procedures, policies, training programs, and protocols, to explore the frameworks and procedures implemented as well as the outcomes and gaps from the models and frameworks studied, strengths and weaknesses, to explore the applicability of the models and frameworks studied in Ontario not-for-profit sector and other transnational examples, to identify gaps and potential models or elements that could be integrated into best practices, tools, and resources for an optimized model of inclusive, equitable, and collaborative leadership in the non-for-profit sector. So some of the findings. I will now discuss the main findings. Collaborative leadership. First, defining collaborative leadership. Defining and examining collaboration is complex, as it is simultaneously a concept, an action, and a form of leadership involving macro-social, institutional, structural, and interpersonal contexts, power dynamics, and subjectivities. Collaborative leadership manifests in getting things done without exercising power and control over. Collaboration is considered a requirement for sustainable success in the current interdependent global context, particularly as it allows leaders to build relationships, handle conflict, and share control. In spite of this, leaders report difficulties in learning collaboration skills as they are not taught. Collaborative leadership characteristics, looking at competency models. Inquiry into collaborative leadership has focused predominantly on personal traits or characteristics of the leader. Big picture thinking, coaching, mediation, negotiation, risk analysis, contract management, strategic thinking, interpersonal communications, and team building are some of the skills identified as necessary to successfully lead collaboratively. Other core collaborative leadership competencies include ability to resolve conflict, communication skills, ability to understand other perspectives, and expertise in the problem area. In addition to encompassing listening skills, collaborative leadership is also conceptualized as the ability to convene others to solve problems jointly, to energize around a problem, to facilitate the work of others, and to create a vision and solve problems. In terms of models of collaborative leadership competencies, researchers show that there is discordance between the competencies human resource managers believe are required to collaborate and the competencies exemplary collaborators demonstrate. This is Geta Taylor's 2008 competency model of effective executive collaborators based on evidence from superior quote-unquote performers. Geta Taylor conducted research comparing an inventory of competencies related to collaborative leadership from human resources with competencies from leaders with high levels of successful collaboration. She then came up with this model based on the latter, establishing competencies and the corresponding indicators. So we can see interpersonal understanding demonstrates empathy. The indicator is listening to understand other perspectives and needs, develops close relationships, people at all levels. Receptiveness to others is dependent on position, rank, and unable to understand perspectives outside own expertise. I'm not going to read everything, but you can see these examples. I'm just going to read the titles. Interpersonal understandings, motivation, teamwork and cooperation, inclusive perspectives on achievement, teamwork and cooperation, altruistic perspectives on resource sharing. See the indicators, the ones right there. Teamwork and cooperation, collaborative conflict resolution, teamwork leadership bridges diversity, and teamwork leadership creates line of sight. And you can see the examples of the indicators beside. So this is one example that was used. Strategies for building core collaborative capacities. After conducting an extensive review of coalition and multiple stakeholder collaboration literature, Foster, Fishman, Berkowitz, Lounsbury, Jacobson, and Allen developed an integrated model for building the conditions needed for coalitions to promote effective collaboration and build sustainable community change, a concept known as collaborative capacity. This concept is based on the notion that success in collaborative efforts encompasses individual as well as organizational dimensions. Foster, Fishman, and colleagues argue that coalitions require collaborative capacity within their members, within their relationships, within their organizational structure, and within the programs they sponsor. In addition to describing each aspect, their model also proposes strategies to develop each component as shown on this table. So for example, the building member capacity. One of the building member capacities is understand current member capacity, value the diversity of member competencies, enhance current member capacities, engage in incentive management, and foster positive intergroup understanding. An example of the value the diversity of member competencies. Under that, they talk about reinforce and maximize use of existing skills, knowledge, determine the unique aspects, example, culture, language, skill, connections of each member, and create settings where the talents are used. Also, another example will be under the building member capacity is enhance current member capacities. Providing training in technical, programmatic, and relational areas, foster sharing and dissemination of knowledge, and recruit new members with needed skill sets were examples of building members' capacity. Also, the second piece talked about was building relational capacity. Under that was building positive intergroup interactions, create group norms, develop subordinate shared goals, create inclusive decision-making, build diverse membership, and support diversity. Example of creative inclusive decision-making was ensure that all members have a voice in the decision-making process. Acts quiet members for their stakeholders. Also, another example of build diverse membership is determine critical constituencies given coalition's issue and context, include the most diverse and representative array of stakeholders as is feasible, target recruitment strategies, frame issues to appeal to a diverse set of stakeholders, and include different types of people in leadership positions. I also read the next one, support diversity. An example is identify barriers to surveys or discussions that may impede participation, create supports and strategies for reducing barriers, carpooling, hiring an interpreter, etc. Create subcommittees whose members represent stakeholder diversity and provide technical assistance to enhance current capacities. So those are some examples of building relational capacity. The building organizational capacity, and under that, there was proactively build leadership, develop task focus, formalize role processes, value member diversity, and build external relationships. And I'll just give examples of value member diversity and build external relationships. So under value member diversity is acknowledge that self-interest is to be expected and should be respected. Encourage group members to voice their unique concerns in each meeting and incorporate diverse goals into the work plan. Under build external relationships is seek input from sectors not represented in coalition membership and share information with external constituencies in a timely manner. Seek out best practice information and involve community residents in program planning, implementation, and evaluation, and make accomplishments visible to the community at large. So these are some examples of this model using building organizational capacity. And the last heading is building pragmatic capacity. Seek community input and develop innovative programs. And under those, seek a community input is conduct regular needs assessments. This is quite critical. Seek community input in planning processes. Develop innovative programs. Use member and community input to identify innovative ways to meet needs and identify your niche. Avoid duplicating or competing with existing program strategies. So that's some examples of that model for strategies for building core collaborative capacities. The next part, what we're going to look at is collaborative leadership in action, collaborative leadership in education particularly. Collaboration is an important aspect for teacher capacity and professional knowledge. Research in the field of collaborative leadership in education point out to the relevance of individual values as well as organizational culture as facilitators or obstacles for implementing collaborative learning and leadership. Inquiry into collaborative leadership in education conducted in the USA and Canada concluded that teachers perceive significant deficiencies in their school support for collaboration. They perceive that their work environment main focus is on individualism and competition, lacking the trust and care which would be conducive to collaborative practice. Research in the area indicated that teachers' self-reported collaborative practice was predominantly joint or shared in servicing. Additionally, teachers in primary and elementary grade level schools tend to collaborate more by way of team planning and teaching, mentoring, and peer observation in comparison to middle schools, junior high schools, and high school teachers. Also, the research indicated that teachers in larger schools collaborate less than those working in smaller schools. Leonard 2002 advocates for greater focus on articulating underlying values and beliefs about educational practice, as well as for professional development focused on collaborative skills. Collaborative leadership in health, interprofessional collaboration. Interprofessional collaboration relates to decision-making processes and service delivery in healthcare. Interprofessional collaborative practice requires a partnership between a team of health providers and the client in a participatory, collaborative, and coordinated approach to shared decision-making around health and social issues. Collaborative leadership has been demonstrated to promote better outcomes in patient care. However, its implementation requires significant changes in functioning at the organizational, team, and personal professional levels. The Canadian Interprofessional Health Collaborative 2010 outlines the following leadership qualities to facilitate interprofessional collaboration. It's another example. So working with others to enable effective patient-client outcomes. The advantage of interdependent working relationships among all participants. Facilitation of effective team processes, facilitation of effective decision-making, establishment of a climate of collaborative practice among all participants, co-creation of a climate of shared leadership and collaborative practice, application of collaborative decision-making principles, and the integration of the principles of continuous quality improvement to work processes and outcomes. An example now of collaborative leadership in the not-for-profit sector. Collaboration was identified as an important theme in the not-for-profit organizations, often mentioned as examples of community research published mainly in academic journals. Collaborative leadership models presented in previous sections highlighted the importance of shared power and control, building trust, conflict mediation, and prevention, as well as valuing diverse perspectives. Within the not-for-profit sector, this aspect appears to be addressed from perspectives that emphasize inclusion of diversity and anti-oppression frameworks in research, community work, and advocacy. Examining the complexities of implementing a collaborative multi-site research project involves multiple stakeholders, service providers, and people with lived experiences of mental health and homelessness. Nelson et al. 2016 is an example, outlines what worked well, their main challenges, and lessons learned as follows. So what worked well in the study, and we're talking here about the collaborative process which was measured, not necessarily the actual study. What worked well? Choosing a program solution around which multiple partners could ally, the values of the project including consumer choice, recovery, community integration, and social justice provided a common vision and purpose for local level collaboration and planning. Creating site coordinator positions and selecting someone with credibility with multiple spheres who understand the different worldviews of stakeholders. Organizing consultation sessions with people with lived experience, very critical. Establishing reference groups to regularly solicit their input, hiring people with lived experience for project positions, providing training for their project participation in research. Service provision, governance, and having a national consumer research consultant who assisted the sites in promoting the involvement of people with lived experience. Were all some examples of positive outcomes from the project. Some challenges. There was little time to address questions of structure and relationships and process. The limited time for planning was particularly apparent when issues of power needed to be addressed. Bringing marginalized groups meaningfully into the collaborative structures, relationships, and processes required more time. Some lessons learned from this project. Establish a clear purpose of the collaboration. Dedicate time for partners to familiarize with the nature of the planning tasks and processes to learn about each other and to establish a common vocabulary and practices for achieving their goals. Define clear expectations about the nature of the hybrid planning environment, which is not fully participatory, involving implementation of evidence-based interventions with clear fidelity standards under tight timelines. Extra attention must be given to attending to issues of power, social justice, and creating structures and processes that are inclusive of people with lived experience and other marginalized groups, such as Aboriginal people and various ethno-racial groups. So this is one example that was looked at in the research. In terms of anti-oppression models, Bonoff and Mowat, 2007, discussed how community-based social service agencies have faced pressure from communities and funders to adopt anti-oppression frameworks in their daily operations. Emerging from feminist and critical race theories and activism, anti-oppression is considered the dominant social work model, Wilson and Barefoot, 2000. Anti-oppression analysis seeks to identify and eliminate interlocking oppressions and dominance, providing the tools to critically analyze systemic inequities and contextualize intersecting sources of inequality. Ian Wagner, 2013. Critiques of the framework have centered on its being predominantly general, theoretical, and abstract, with a main focus on its applicability in education and mental health. Other criticisms center on its emphasis on oppression and identities as fixed, therefore limiting an analysis of the simultaneity of oppressed and oppressor subject positions. Other critiques of the model relate to its difficulty in considering all forms of oppression and considering the difficulties implementing large-scale systemic and structural change due to the social, political, and structural mechanisms that preserve the status quo. Between 2009 and 2010, Yee, Hashbush, and Wung, 2015, conducted a consultation with 109 participants from 44 children's aid societies from Ontario. This is another example of an anti-oppression approach, based on the material gathered from the collaborative effort with participants, including frontline and management. Yee came up with an anti-oppression framework and model for the Children's Aid Society, which will be included in the final report of the literature review and discussed later on. Collaborative leadership and intersectionality. The Combahee River. This is an important place. Where does intersectionality come from? How can we look at intersectional collaborative leadership? The earliest articulations of intersectionality can be traced to the 70s in the Manifesto by Combahee River Collective, a collective of black feminists, who stated in 1977, "We find it difficult to separate race from class from sex oppression because in our life they are most often experienced simultaneously." In the 80s, many scholars elaborated on the limitations of the isolation of categories such as race, class, and gender as a primary category of identity, difference, or oppression. Legal scholar and critical race theorist Kimberly Crenshaw, 1989-1993, is credited with originating the term intersectionality. Intersectionality helps in understanding how multiple social statuses might be experienced simultaneously. It highlights the ways that analysis considering categories such as race and gender independently may be limited because in practice, individuals experience these oppressions simultaneously. They also assist in understanding how some members of oppressed groups can also hold privileged identity. Smooth explains that intersectionality helps to make sense of the experiences of people who find themselves living at the intersections of social identities. Intersectionality also is concerned with the systems that give meaning to the categories of race, gender, class, sexual identity, gender identity, among others. In other words, at the societal level, intersectionality seeks to make visible the systems of oppression that maintain power hierarchies and organize society while also providing a means to theorize experience at the individual level. The richness of intersectionality as a concept and method has not been utilized fully to examine the systems that perpetuate power imbalances in the workplace. Glenn identified three main levels where processes of racialization and gendering take place in the market economy and citizenship. This is another example. Glenn looked at representation, symbols, language, and images to express and convey, and spatial rules to orchestrate interaction within and across of race, gender boundaries, and social structure or the allocation of power and material resources along race and gender lines. Other analysis of how power is exercised in the workplace assert that power is organized and maintained in four areas: structural, institutions; disciplinary, practices that sustain bureaucratic hierarchies; hegemonic, images, symbols, and ideologies that shape consciousness; and interpersonal, patterns of interaction between individuals and groups. Criticisms have emerged in relation to a tendency to talk about intersectionality in reference to subjective personal experiences of difference without seeking to understand the processes and mechanisms that transform difference into inequities and oppression. Implementing an intersectional methodology in the establishment of collaborations can be simultaneously complicated and powerful. Some argue that this methodology can facilitate the creation of collaborative efforts that move beyond single identity issues. This, however, requires constant negotiation among participants to ensure that consensus building is reached without further marginalizing or silencing. This is one organization example. This is actually an example from one of our partners in the CLiP project. I would like to talk briefly about the Committee for Accessible Age Treatment, CATS. You can visit their website at the URL on the slide. This organization is one of our partner agencies in this initiative, and this committee was started around 1999 as an initiative of service providers and community members, in this case, people living with HIV/AIDS. On their website, you will find a number of resources, including research reports and newsletters. Three highlights of how CAT implements collaborative leadership are the following. One, their commitment to greater and meaningful involvement of people living with HIV. The committee has established clear mechanisms that ensure representation of PHAs in positions of leadership on the steering committee, including a succession plan. Number two, the committee actually engages and promotes participation from diverse communities from anti-oppression perspectives. Communities served and leading are people who identify as immigrant, refugee, and non-status. Number three, the committee has achieved a degree of specialization, successfully conducting community-based research and developing interventions. Collaboration has involved academics, community members, service providers, and policymakers. This is one example of one of our partners. So in conclusion, in terms of talking about a definition of intersectionality, anti-oppression, and collaborative leadership, and in terms of what is needed for your organization and agency, I think first I'll talk about a little bit about the gaps in research from doing this literature review. So some gaps in research are as follows. As indicated in the beginning, collaborative leadership is a concept difficult to measure. A significant gap in the literature pertains to the mechanisms utilized by organizations to foster collaborative leadership. In the not-for-profit sector, organizations do not systematically document their collaborative efforts and their impact. It appears that organizations are focused on implementing strategies and securing funding and execution of their funding, and there is limited time and resources to evaluate their collaborative efforts. This results in missed opportunities to share knowledge and resources. All models of collaborative leadership talk about the importance of participation, power sharing, prevention of conflicts, valuing diversity. However, there is a gap in relation to indicators, strategies, and processes to deal with power imbalances derived from oppression and systems of dominance, exclusion on the basis of socioeconomic status, gender, gender identity, age, disability, etc. An anti-oppression intersectional approach has great potential to assist in addressing these gaps. However, this approach needs to focus on establishing models, policies, protocols, and evaluative processes to document their impact. So definition of intersectional anti-oppression collaborative leadership is needed. Active research in this area is needed to establish a definition that is based both on theory and practice of lived experiences of oppressed and marginalized groups' experiences and their leadership, such as Indigenous, African Black, LGBTQ, working class, immigrants, refugee, non-status communities that challenge and deconstruct systemic structures of power and dominance that continuously and historically and contemporary create disempowerment, often resulting in health, financial, and well-being disparities and violence. Steps needed to make intersectional anti-oppression collaborative leadership work in your organization need to be established after and through a process of rigorous critical engagement in anti-oppression audit of self, personal, community, and organizational processes to ensure implementation in a responsible and accountable way. So these are some of the highlights of the literature review. The literature review will be released, the final results, on December 15th. You'll be able to download it from OPHA's and Health Nexus, hopefully.
The CLiP website.
The CLIP's website. Now we're just going to open it up for questions, any questions and comments, a dialogue on some of the things that were discussed. And I also wanted just to say that a definition wasn't given of what intersectional anti-oppression collaborative leadership, and there was also not a chart given of how you can do this in your organization, because the process that needs to happen is as I said earlier, a process of self, personal, community, and organization discovery through an anti-oppression praxis. And I think giving a definition right now, I could give a definition based on my experience and my work, but I think that it's up to an organization to also look at some of those details. So if there's any question that people might have in asking how can you do that, and also even where are you at in this process in your organizations, would be interesting to talk about right now. So I would like to open the discussion. Anybody have any questions or comments?
Thank you so much, Roberta. And I just want to tell you what's happening on the screen there. So the chat box is still open and you can type there. But also we've opened a very large question and answer box. And in the bottom of that box, there's a line where you can type in your question. And when questions are typed in, then we will verbally read them out to bring them into the conversation in the phone. And are we, Andrea, going to open the phone line?
We can. I'll just unmute everyone. And in the meantime, I'll just mention that, yes, the slides will be posted along with the webinar recording on the CLiP website in a few days, because we've had a few questions about that. Okay. I just need to navigate back to a slide to unmute. So I'll navigate for 1 second. Sorry, everyone, I've taken your questions away, but we will get that back in 1 second.
Okay, we're back. So keep away and take your turn to speak out as well, and I'll pass it back to you, Roberta, to moderate and respond.
So kind of one of the questions that we're asking is, where are you at in terms of your organization's intersectional anti-oppression collaborative leadership process? Where are you at? What are some of your thoughts? Some of the challenges, and such as that.
For anyone participating, if you could please mute your line by pressing *6. Thank you.
So John Samuel is sharing an email there. John, are you available?
Jean has asked for the slide.
Oh, okay. Okay.
That's not anything you need.
Sounds good. Some action following the webinar. People can also speak into the phone if you're on the line. We have a question question from the room here, who's part of the team, but we've
hi.
got lots of questions for Roberta today.
Yeah, while others are putting together their questions. It's Pegeen speaking from Ontario Public Health Association. Thanks so much, Roberta, for sharing your findings. One of the things that struck me was when you talked about the education sector, and so as you described the challenges that are within that sector, and if you see education very much focused on individualism, then what does that mean in terms of as people are aging and then entering the nonprofit sector or other sectors, and the expectation that they're working collaboratively? So I was interested if you could speak a bit more about what does that mean in terms of long-term implications if we find it a sector that has such a critical role in shaping people's perspective.
Thank you, Pegeen. I think, first of all, even in defining what the educational sector is, many things. I gave an example of teachers in elementary schools, but the education also happens in nonprofit organizations, happens in training, it happens in different sectors. So the individualistic and kind of competitive process that happens within the educational system is a problem when you're looking at not only aging populations, but also looking at in terms of diversity. Because we're looking at collaborations and we're looking at resource sharing, we're looking at information sharing, it becomes a problem if we're only looking at individual solutions and individual leadership models. For example, there's a lot of social justice practices in school systems, in educational training, et cetera, but they're very low funded and they're not systemically, which means the government is not supporting it in terms of promoting collaboration. So there's more, larger schools get less funding, small schools get more funding, usually private and public. You can even look at rural and urban. You can also look at who is in certain areas where money is given in racialized areas or urban areas. There's less funding given often. I think in terms of a solution, collaborative leadership from an anti-oppression or intersectional approach can be phenomenal. It's about sharing those resources, also sharing not only sharing resources, but also sharing the social justice processes to getting resources. So in an individual competitive society, we're looking at individual competitiveness. But what happens if we can change that, we can challenge that, and we can actually share resources and share our knowledge and do things from a way that comes from anti-oppression, looks at issues of racism, looks at issues of sexism, transphobia, et cetera, within the educational system, because we know that is a problem. How can we do that in a more simultaneous way? Then we can come up with more solutions from a collaborative process. It is being done, but it's not heavily resourced through government. Very a lot of nonprofit support and also voluntary basis programming.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Okay. We have a couple of questions that have been typed in, and so Jean has asked, which can be a follow-up from not having had the background of training in school, what do managers and supervisors and other leaders in the organization play what do your managers, I guess, what role do your managers, supervisors, and other leaders in the organization play in building collaborative leadership as an organizational process? And I know because of your work doing NTO work with lots of organizations, you could speak to that.
Thank you, Jean, for the question. It's a great question. I think that it depends on the organization and it depends on the history of the organization. So organizations who have some type of anti-oppression policy already in place might have an anti-oppression committee or diversity committee in place and that are trying to kind of champion anti-oppression practices. Their management, their boards would be trained in anti-oppression practices, the basic one, or how to do collaborative leadership, perhaps in 101. It would be something that the managers and managers, ED, the board, it's something that they buy into in terms of working in a collaborative anti-oppression way. What happens, unfortunately, is that there's a lot of programs that have trying to create access for people, particularly say the educational system or the health system, for people who are living with health disparities. There's a lot of programs, there's a lot of really good programs, but people don't have time or funding to do the research, and managers don't have time or funding to actually do that research. So I think a part of the manager's role in providing an anti-oppression collaborative leadership is to actually, first of all, do the personal and self work that needs to happen. So a lot of people want to do anti-repression approach, but they haven't done their own audit for themselves and their board, their own self as managers to see, you know, the learnings and competencies that they need to have to be able to actually successfully support an anti-oppression or intersectional collaborative leadership. I think sometimes people, it's kind of mandated or mission statement, or people are trying to, but they don't actually have the experience or the time to actually do it. So it depends on where the organization is in terms of their anti-oppression practice. I think that in terms of my work, I know I've worked with a lot of managers on doing a lot of anti-oppression consultation individually and group. And what we do is, first of all, talk about, you know, their location, where they are, who they are, what they see the organization doing in terms of anti-oppression, and then actually looking at kind of doing an anti-oppression audit, which I talked about a little bit in the conclusion. An anti-oppression audit is to look at the personal, individual, your community, look at the organization, look at what anti-oppression means. What do you want to do? What changes do you want to make in your community? How do you do it? How do you implement it? How do you create an evaluative process for it also to measure these places and spaces in terms of anti-oppression practice?
I just posted notes of what you said, Roberta. It came up as Gillian Gracious, but that's because I posted it in. But that was some notes on what you just shared. So the other question we have in here is, can you recommend a tool that health units can begin to use to measure their efforts and use as a monitoring tool?
In the final report, I'll give you some examples of some tools that were used. I think there are different tools that show examples of actual anti-oppression practices. Unfortunately, there's not that many tools of actually showing how do you actually measure that collaboration. So there's a lot of, you know, anti-oppression tools, diversity tools, and how do you bring that in the organization, how do you bring policies and processes, which there's examples which will be given in the final study, but there's not as much in terms of the collaborative processes measuring that. And that's I think the key of even this research was measuring collaborative processes and looking at collaborative processes, how you actually do collaboration, and does it come from an anti-oppression process. The Nielsen study, that 2016 results, that study actually was a study on homelessness, housing, and mental health, and it involved different stakeholders and spaces and places. It's a big study. It was done in Toronto. It was done in Ontario, nationally, but it's Toronto-based in terms of some of the main people in the study. And in that study, they do kind of give a tool in terms of I talked about it earlier, in terms of not necessarily a tool, but they talked about the challenges and the benefits of how to do a collaborative process. That would be one example, and in the final study, there'll be some tools. The problem is that actually the research is needed to actually find tools that can actually collaborate to create collaborative intersectional anti-oppression leadership. So there's tools for many, you know, how to create collaborative leadership. There's tools of how to have anti-oppression perspective, which I'll give you, but to do those things together, there's not as many. There are a couple examples that I do have that you can see when you get the final report.
So we have a question from Nishma Danani. How does cultural competency and anti-oppression practice align or intersect?
Great question.
Great question.
Excellent question. The history of cultural competency I think is important to look at, and I know we can't do a full history now, but cultural competency came a lot from out of first of, you know, this kind of multiculturalism, and it was cultural competency. How competent can you be, or how competent are you in different cultures, etc. I tend not to use cultural competency. I tend to use anti-oppression competency. I find that cultural competency doesn't talk about power dynamics. It doesn't talk about systems of oppression, and it doesn't necessarily talk about accountability and responsibility, which is something that anti-oppression talks about. How do we become accountable, and how are we responsible for making changes in a system that has or creates, you know, disparities, oppression, violence, etc. Anti-oppression competencies, to me, is a better way to look at it. What is your understanding of first of all, systemic oppressions. What's your understanding of racism, classism, homophobia, transphobia, sexism, ageism, etc.? And what is your understanding of how you, first of all, look at internally how you're responsible and what are you accountable for changing, and then how can you do that organizationally? How can you change and change those same systems that, impact our organizations and communities? I mean, we're living in a white settler colony. We're living in Turtle Island. We have to look at the impact of colonization, and cultural competency is something that I think comes from more maybe a resiliency piece and not a necessary resistance or changing piece. It's like, okay, this exists. We need to understand different people in different levels, but it's the change impact that is missing, and I think an anti-oppression competency is a better way to look at it, particularly from an intersectional perspective. Thank you for the question.
Well, we have an earlier question from Margaret Milner, who's asking what connections have been made with the Simon Fraser Institute and the Public Health Agency of Canada. Yes, and before I do, also Stephanie says, wonderful response, thank you. Margaret Milner's question is, what connections have been made? I'm assuming Margaret's asking about connections between the CLiP project and the Simon Fraser Institute and the Public Health Agency of Canada.
Right. Well, right now we're in the early stages of finishing the CLiP project. It's a 2-year initiative, and we're talking about funding and access, and sometimes coming up but not having sustainability, not having the funds to continue, and those kind of structural difficulties. Right now, I would say that we don't have necessarily a relationship. Hopefully, and forging some type of connection. I think the point of this discussion is to actually look at maybe where do we go from here? What's the next steps? What organizations do we need to connect with, et cetera? We don't have a formal connection with them. I don't know if you want to.
It's Bean speaking. I did want to talk about Public Health Agency of Canada because we have a good relationship with their regional office, and we know at the national level there's issues of leadership competency. So we've been asking them to identify contacts at the national level, because one of the things we're interested in doing at OPHA is supporting a intensive leadership development program, and within that program we would want to support leaders as they develop these types of skills. So that is something that also told them about the Collaborative Leadership Project, and so that's a good suggestion in terms of continuing those connections and seeing ways that we can work together to promote these concepts. Thank you.
Another thing I talked about the Simon Fraser Institute. Just personally, I know I've had some connection with them in doing looking at intersectionality and anti-oppression and their trauma-informed perspective, and they do a lot of good work. So I think that's a really good question. I think it would be essential for people who are continuing this project on to connect and make those connections and make the information share. We have a big Vancouver, also BC. There's a lot of people from Vancouver who are very interested in participating in this project, but this project was only provincial. So these are the limitations of research such as this, studies such as this. We didn't have the funding to actually allow people to participate, but perhaps there will be other ways that we can do that.
Oh, I'm really glad you raised that, Roberta, because we were surprised with our Learning Institute on intersectionality, anti-oppression, and collaborative leadership that we thought the participants would be coming from different sectors in Ontario, but in fact we had participants from Quebec, from Manitoba, from Alberta, from BC, and so I remember at the time thinking that would be a terrific opportunity to go to our national college and say, look, there's obviously a national interest in this topic. Would they be supportive of providing funding so that we could carry on this kind of training and development?
And also we'll be sending the reports to particular people who identified their interest in information from BC and around. So we'll definitely be giving them those copies.
So we have a question from McEwen, wondering if the concept of cultural safety is also being considered, and I'll take this for that one.
Okay. I think cultural safety is also another concept that is important to look at. Yes, it has to be considered, particularly when we're looking at collaboration and the importance of trust. A lot of the research on collaborative leadership, trust was a big piece. Like you have to trust, you have to also be able to deal with conflict, And cultural safety speaks about that. And the word cultural has many connotations.
Flu shot. Visit ontario.ca/flu for a clinic near you. Paid for by the Government of Ontario.
McMaster Center for Continuing Education.
So,
Sorry about that.
are we good? Were we able to clear that, or do we need to?
It's on hold now.
It looks like it's good now.
Okay.
We're just on hold with one person now who's just beeping in the background.
So I think cultural safety is a part of cultural safety is having anti-oppression competency. So understanding and knowing what anti-oppression intersectionality is, doing your own work, number one, first, looking at the policies, the policies, leaders in organizations, having a disciplinary response to what happens when oppression occurs, and how do you actually do collaborative leadership or collaborative connections without actually looking at yourself and your own anti-oppression practice is, I don't know how people can do that, but many people do, is critical to creating cultural safety. So I think it's an essential piece. I think that it can also be looked at as calling it, again, sometimes it's called anti-oppression safety, it's called sometimes strategic protection. There's different things that people use, but I think it's critical to the work, and it's a big area that needs to be discussed more and also researched more. But a lot of cultural safety is done in many other research areas and studies and places. And also looking at how you can do less damage or less harm, is really important also. How do you actually create social change, do less harm? How do you actually create spaces and places for marginalized, racialized, Indigenous populations to have leadership and also have the safety to engage in the sometimes and often difficult conversations, also coming from experiences of violence, the impact of transgenerational trauma. How do you actually create safety in these spaces is critical. So it's a really important question, and there's more work to be done in that area. I think I do talk about it, but I think the extent needs to be expanded in terms of how you do this work for sure.
We're just going to pause for one quick second to mute all of the lines. One moment.
Muted.
Hi, everyone. Andrea just muted all the lines to get rid of the background noise. And so at this point now, it's only us who are speaking in the teleconference, but you can unmute if you want to ask a question or make a comment through the telephone. So we're going to move on. This is just so rich, and it's wonderful because we've had a good amount of time for questions and discussion, and we're continuing. So the next one is from Jean again. Asking, anti-oppression is being critiqued for being too soft in addressing systemic structural oppression, particularly in the area of racism. There is a push to move from the discourse of anti-oppressive practice to that of white privilege and dominance. What are your thoughts on this?
Thank you for that question. I also think, yes, anti-oppression is being critiqued and it can be critiqued, but also depends on how you define anti-oppression. So in my definition of anti-oppression, I look at white privilege, white unearned privilege, I look at white supremacy, I look at systems of oppression, I look at Indigenous rights and self-determination. So it depends on what our definitions are, and I think it's partly the problem is that anti-oppression sometimes is used, but it's not necessarily defined, or it's defined in a way that is problematic. It sometimes, as I talked about earlier, has kind of these fixed notions of what oppression is or isn't. And I think that there needs to be clear definitions that look at power from white unearned privilege, white supremacy, and other types of practices. There are many examples too of anti-oppression practitioners. I also use anti-colonial. I mean, as I said, it depends on kind of what your experience is and how you use it. I do critique the use of anti-oppression with not having a definition. Just saying I do anti-oppression work and not having a definition can be problematic, because it doesn't have, then you don't have any, in terms of accountability. What's the accountability of it? What do you mean by that? How do you do it? But there's a lot of practices and definitions that don't have explanations that are used. Health equity is another one that's often not explained. Social determinants of health also is not explained properly. And if you look at the histories of those movements, because they came from social movements, a lot of the social movements are taking out of these practices. So health equity, often anti-oppression is not used in some places, and social determinants of health has become this kind of a health,
like a catch-all.
exactly, a catch-all or a category that is put on. So I think that when we connect things to social justice movements, to history, to contemporary experiences of oppression, of colonization, of sexism, of racism, anti-black racism, anti-indigeneity, transphobia, homophobia, we say the actual things that are happening in our communities and the violence and oppression that it's experiencing, and also the resistance, how we're resisting, how we're fighting back, how we're doing change, the impact. When we use those words, I think we can have a better description. I think I'm not for just not using anti-oppression, because in so many cases and spaces, diversity is still being used. And diversity is so problematic. I mean, I understand that you got to use it to get funding sometimes, but it has so much, way more limits than anti-oppression. So yes, let's critique anti-oppression. Let's make people explain what they're doing. Let's have implementation processes. Let's have accountability, but let's not totally stop using it. And let's include, as you said, let's talk about unearned privilege, talk about white supremacy, talk about colonization, the impact, etc. I think basically we need to include definitions and practices that define lived experiences in a clearer and more, a stronger way. So I do agree with you. I just think that we need to, ask people to explain what they're talking about a little bit more.
Yeah, it's making me think, Roberta, it's Andrea speaking, that really we have a tendency to label things so then we don't have to spend the time talking about them. So you're just really reminding us that we have to really spend some time talking about the words that we use instead of just labeling and moving on.
Right. I want to mention one thing, just so you mind. There's a concept that I use in my work called identity trichotomy, and there's like three main areas of identity trichotomy. One is the box, looking at the box, the box that people are put in, the kind of the stereotypes, the oppression that people are put in for particular how they identify and the different oppressions they experience. The second piece is about negotiating understandings and negotiating what our meanings are. So I think that in a place of kind of an anti-colonial, anti-oppression space and place, we need to actually negotiate what our understandings of terms are, what our words are. When you're doing collaborative leadership in a group, you're doing an anti-oppression approach, what does that mean? What does racism mean to you? What does sexism mean to you? What does resistance mean to you? What does resilience mean? And also critiquing resilience, which is, I think, important too. So I think all of those things can be negotiated in particular ways, but I do talk about identity trichotomy in a lot of my work, and I think it's one way to look at some ways to discuss anti-oppression, but particularly from an intersectional perspective.
And what's the third part of the trichotomy?
Oh gosh, my head right now.
Totally put you on the spot. Just
I know.
I'm taking notes.
That's the problem with that.
You know what? I can't remember the third piece right now. It's probably because I've been up very late. But gosh, I can't remember it.
That's okay, because we're running short on
that
time.
happens, people, because a lot of things in my head right now.
This is a fabulously rich moment in time, and we're all going to continue on this work. So we have 2 minutes left. We have one question that I could maybe pose as a closing question, because it's very action-oriented, which is nice. So Neshma Danani is asking, could you please recommend some anti-oppression training that one can take, train the trainer model in Ontario? I also have an idea to put forth, but you start.
Okay. Thank you for the question. Anti-oppression training. That could be. Do you have another hour for that? In our discussions that we've been talking about cultural competency and anti-oppression, anti-colonial, different models, indigeneity, the empowerment, etc. There are people who are doing really good anti-oppression training out there. I actually do not want to give names because I think there's a lot of different people. If you're interested, you can connect with me and I can give you some names, because there's also people who are doing very problematic work out there, and I actually don't want to just do a name game right now. But we can give some resources.
Do you feel that, I really respect that, be careful about, because it's all about definitions and what are we doing within it. But one of my experiences with one of the regional gatherings where we were connected with
Right.
one of the universities, there seems to be a lot of good work coming out of some universities and a lot of training there. Us being in the nonprofit sector and the public health sector, we need to create more opportunities for ourselves.
I thank you, Jillian. Yeah, I mean, there's some good people doing some amazing work, and even also my brain is not as function as well as giving names right now, but I can give you. There's also different types of anti-oppression training. Are we talking about anti-oppression 101? Are we talking about managerial training? Are we talking about I do anti-oppression psychotherapy training? There's many different types of training that could be useful. In terms of, we also just did regional event. We just did 3 trainings on
lots of you were there.
on intersectionality, anti-oppression, and collaborative leadership. So I think it's an important piece. Maybe we can give some links after to some training opportunities.
We'll make a note and we'll put something in the email that comes out.
Yeah.
That's great.
And Nashma says, got it, awesome, and I will definitely connect with you.
Excellent. Thank
Let's
you.
all stay connected, and if you saw someone you knew who was also on this webinar, connect with them after the webinar to debrief, because it's great to have someone to talk to about stuff after we've been so stimulated. Thank you, Roberta. We are at time.
Okay.
You have, I can give you a couple more seconds. I just don't want to lose people.
I just want to say, everybody, thank you for participating. Continue to do anti-oppression, intersectional, collaborative leadership work. Continue to do social justice work. Continue to do anti-colonial work. It's empowering. It's hopeful. It's about love. It's about hope. It's about resistance. It's about political action. It's about social action. And, remember to look at Indigenous communities, look at racialized populations, look at queer populations, look at the intersectional pieces, disability communities. Take the strengths from people who are on the trenches, constantly resisting violence on a daily basis. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Roberta. So just so you know, I'm going to close the meeting now. It's been wonderful, and thank you again, Roberta and Andrea, for us doing this together. Bye. This is now going to send you to our evaluation link. We hope you'll have the time to